That is why they are so fervent. TV with your host, Jeff Charles.
Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Right On, where we tackle the issues of the day from the right perspective. Now let's talk about the New York Times. The Columbia Journalism Review published a report discussing how the New York Times played a critical role in crafting the Trump is Putin's puppet narrative after the 2016 election. Yes, we're now in 2023, but better late than never, I suppose. But what does this report say about the New York Times' apparent abandonment of journalistic ethics? What about the overall media environment in America today? Well, I have with me Liberty Nation's senior political correspondent and a huge fan of the New York Times, especially Paul Krugman, Tim Donner.
Oh, yes.
Welcome to the program.
Well, the only bigger fan of Paul Krugman on LibertyNation.com would be Andrew Moran, because he can actually tear down the argument specifically beyond just the common sense, a minimum of which is required to put the lie to his brilliance, Jeff. Look, it's no secret that, and hasn't been for a long time, that very few conservatives believe that the media is balanced, fair, or even distinct from the ruling political class. We've known it by all that they do, but we haven't had it quantified and specified as specifically or nearly as specifically as the Columbia Journalism Review does in this 4-part, 24,000-word expose that goes down into the gory details and the, shall we say, down to the micro level of what was done. Mm-hmm. But I think it doesn't do anything to resolve the notion that the New York Times has descended from a place that was a newspaper of record, the place where it printed all the news that's fit to print, into a high-class propaganda arm for the progressives in Washington, D.C. and the ruling class. And this just puts the lie to it in a very specific way. Now, some people will say, well, big deal. So what was it, a story on Fox News? Of course, they're going to hate the New York Times. No, this was a guy named Jeff Gerth, a reporter for the Times for 30 years. And he's basically serving as an out-of-house ombudsman here for the New York Times and unmasking them in a way that people from the outside, and certainly conservatives, would have no chance to be able to do, because it would be just dismissed as, political partisanship. But they use the Russia collusion hoax to lay the groundwork for how the Times is entirely unaccountable and how they just pander essentially to their readership base. The latte and cafe set on the Upper West Side of New York.
The limousine liberals.
Limousine. Unfortunately, as nice and alliterative as that is, Jeff, it's not realistic anymore. It's now limousine progressives.
Yeah.
But
limousine leftists.
The same ideas in play. But, these people, look, this isn't about changing the New York Times, because, as you would expect, they've delivered a non-denial denial that this was anything, that their coverage was anything but honest, even though it turned out to be the biggest hoax in American political history. And that's really no exaggeration. And this, all the details are there if you care to access them on the Columbia Journalism Review, which, by the way, also has great credibility as essentially a review of journalism from a sensible, centrist, non-partisan, non-ideological perspective.
So can you give us kind of like a quick rundown of what the Columbia Journalism Review highlighted, and also maybe even go into some of the more egregious details that this report exposed about what the New York Times has been doing?
Well, it exposed their absolute willingness to swallow whole cloth what was being fed to them from then the Obama administration, the Clinton presidency, that they were willing to step out on a limb on the Steele report and to basically validate it as factual in the way that they reported the story. They treated this as if it was a fact, and then we'll just get the details behind the larger narrative. So when the larger narrative collapsed under the weight of an over-the-hill Robert Mueller in his investigation, Dean Baquet, then the executive editor of the Times, was flummoxed because his reporters and others from like-minded publications had won Pulitzer Prizes for their coverage of this, and they were all self-congratulatory. What wonderful, Woodward and Bernstein type journalism for what turned out to be a total fraud.
So, you mentioned at least one journalist named David Korn, who basically put on his red cape and tights and flew to the rescue of the New York Times and the Gray Lady. He wrote a piece in Mother Jones defending them. Are you seeing others like him coming out to defend the New York Times, or are they kind of just ignoring this, or how are they reacting?
Well, not either, really. What they're doing is sort of covering it in the sense of they can say they're covering it, but they're not critiquing it. They're trying to present it in selective fashion, right? So that the fact that it came out is worthy of note. So yes, there are liberal, left of center, even far left publications like Mother Jones that are, in fact, acknowledging the existence of it and the fact that it was brought out. But in no way are they trying to, from what I've seen, trying to take on the fight, because these are facts. These are irrefutable. The larger narrative is something, again, you and I and Jeff and people that think like us already knew. But this provides confirmation, hopefully for the people that used to, and that used to include me, the people who viewed the New York Times beyond the, limousine liberals as, the quality and depth of a newspaper that was unparalleled, and you were willing to pay the price of its liberal bias in return for it, because people like us could smoke it out anyway and see what they were trying to do. But, those are the people now that should take note of this, that it's no longer credible. It's turned into nothing more than a megaphone for the progressive left and the ruling elite in Washington.
Yeah, and the thing about it, though, Tim, like when I think about these things, the media, New York Times has been biased forever. All news outlets have some bias. We're all human. It's hard to take that out. But there was at least a sense of, at least trying to be objective. But for some reason, in 2015, 2016, when the Orange Man, What Is Bad came onto the scene, it's like they just took the mask off. It seemed like an almost overnight change where they were just, oh, this is Trump. We've got to attack him. Bam, bam, bam. He's such a horrible person. And it means that, to me, it's like, it's not surprising that the New York Times would have approached the Russiagate narrative as if it were true, and then they just have to fill in the details. I can go to the New York Times and say, Trump tortures puppies in his basement, and they would have no sense of skepticism whatsoever. And I know I'm using hyperbole, but what happened there? Like, what made them go through, being somewhat biased and at least trying to be objective, to just, again, ripping the mask off and saying, nope, we're the resistance, and that's what it is? Because it's not just the New York Times, it's a lot of them.
As he used to say on the famous show, I could name that tune in one note. Trump. When Trump came along, it changed everything. They were forced to turn to the kind of advocacy journalism that they probably wanted to do all along and could only do to a certain degree. And they still held some credibility because of the fact that they did include facts, even if they twisted them a bit. But in the case of Trump, what happened with the Russia collusion story being the most prominent example is they concocted entire narratives that were false. Far from it, it was far from just the Russia collusion thing. It started with he took down the bust of Martin Luther King in the Oval Office, like the second day was there, right, which turned out not to be true. So they built all of these narratives. And what Trump did to the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and the rest of them was what he did to so many people and institutions during the Trump era. He unmasked them. It's like he came into a room infested with cockroaches, turned on the light, and they all went scurrying, and you could see them for the first time. Yeah.
It's funny that you bring up the Martin Luther King bus thing. One of my favorite hoaxes was the koi pond incident in Japan. I don't know if you remember, I wrote about this, where they made it. The thing about the media is that they usually don't lie by making stuff up. They lie by leaving stuff out.
And
so
twisting
when he poured,
it.
I remember when he poured the food into the koi pond, they're like, oh, he's so boorish. He's such a, he has no idea what he's doing. He's such a cad. But then when you see the full footage, you see that he was just following Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's lead, who poured all the food in too. It was beautiful. But I think you brought up a really interesting point, and I hadn't thought about this, but that Trump allowed them to do what they had already been wanting to do in the first place. They wanted to be activists in the first place, but they had to hide behind this air of objectivity. So that leads into my last question. What do you think that the media landscape is going to be like going forward? I mean, do you think it'll ever try to go back to how it was before pre-Trump? I know the leadership of CNN don't know how successful they're going to be. Or do you think that this is just the new reality? Or do you think it's going to get worse?
I think that it probably will come back to a state that it was in before Trump, but very slowly. And not until Trump is completely off the stage. And I'm not even sure that's true, because I have no confidence that they're going to treat Ron DeSantis, for example, if he's the nominee for president, any better than they did Trump. Because now, see, here's the problem, Jeff. They threw all of their weight, the institutional weight of the media, the political class, the nonprofit sector, the academic sector, and everywhere from unions to management, joined together to take Trump down in 2020. And so, they, in their minds, they said, we put the pedal to the metal. We did everything in our power to take down Trump. And you know what? It worked. So why would they not try it again with Trump or DeSantis or anybody else? They might have a tougher time with Nikki Haley, for example, but for most of them, and with Tim Scott, for example, because he's black, they'd have to go a little lighter on it, although they would probably call him, like Clarence Thomas, a lawn jockey for the far right.
See, I think they would go harder on Tim Scott, honestly.
Well, they go harder than they were when they still respected, a person's dignity and saw them as something more than just a conglomeration of demographic and political beliefs.
Well, I mean, we will definitely see this coming up. I mean, we got 24 coming up, and we're going to see how they react, regardless of who's the nominee. But as always, we will be covering this, and we will be paying very close attention to what our friends in the Fourth Estate do. But thanks for joining the program, Tim.
Well, Jeff, as you know, the fun for 2024 is just getting started. Thanks.
You got it. And remember, the show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Just go to LibertyNation.com on your browser or hit Rumble, YouTube, or check out our Liberty Nation News Roku channel. I'm Jeff Charles. Thank you so much for watching. This program is a production of LibertyNation.com, where truth is making a comeback.
Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh.
You heard it here first.
Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.
That is why they are so fervent. TV with your host, Jeff Charles.
Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.